All right. Hello, students. I hope you guys are doing okay today. It is 7 p.m. Eastern, and we are live. So if you are joining live, then if you have questions throughout the course of the lecture, just type them um, into the chat feature, and I will see them on the screen. So thanks for your feedback for the last lecture and your questions. I got some of your questions via email and was able to answer some of those. What I may do going forward if you email me questions about the lecture, I may just go ahead and copy the entire class on the answers so that in case someone else had that same question. And if you are asking yourself, why is Professor Raines wearing pajamas? Whether or not pajamas or scrubs. For those of you that don't know, when I am not going live on YouTube or grading discussion boards and essays and tests for Elim or for one of the other two schools I am an adjunct for, I work for Johnson & Johnson. So I spend my days in the hospital and in the cardiovascular catheterization lab. I spend my day with cardiologists talking about anticoagulants and everything related to the disease states that anticoagulants treat. And so I do that all day, every day, and I've been doing it for 18 years and teaching when I can. So I'm very fortunate to have the opportunity to teach you guys at Elim. Really like it here, and I hope you do too. So here's what we're going to do tonight. So not quite as long a lecture as we had during the first one, but we're going to cover a couple of major topics in this lecture, primarily heresies, some of the major heresies that the church faced in the first, 400 ish years of the church, and then how those heresies sort of underscored the importance of the bishop. And as we will see throughout the rest of this semester, as we study the history of Christianity, at least up into the Reformation, you will see how important the office of the bishop is. You'll find out that if there is an office in the church that you would want to corrupt for money or power, then bishop is what that office would be. And so that's why really in the Protestant church, you do see some of the denominations that have bishops in that that ecclesiology, that feature of their governmental structure. But generally speaking, it's not nearly as prominent as it is in other churches. So thinking back to the last lecture, I spoke about Arianism, the Arian controversy, and how that provided the impetus for the first ecumenical council, which is a big deal in the history of Christianity. And so what we want to start with now is some of the major heresies. And we're not going to cover every heresy. If you just do a Google search for Christian heresies or controversies, first 1,000 years, you just put that into the search feature, you're going to come up with, honestly, as long as I've been studying the history of Christianity, you're going to come up with some heresies and some controversies that I'm not even really that familiar with, because there's just so many different issues. And I want to kind of explain that. It's not like the history of the Christian church is riddled with arguments and dissensions, right? It's not like it was just constant persecution and constant arguing, right? That is not the case. But what historians have done, and I'm not against this, I think this has been a good way to do it. What historians have done is they've said, okay, we're gonna talk about some of these heresies because what these heresies ended up doing, and I'm using the term heresy, it wasn't a heresy until it was declared a heresy. And so you could use a word, you could use heresy, or you could use internal, external threat. You could use those terms, or you could use controversy as a term. But what those controversies did was they typically forced the church to consider what orthodoxy looked like compared to the challenge. And in some cases, when the threat came, like Arian, for instance, it wasn't like the Christian church did not know what it believed about the nature of Jesus. But when Arian started teaching a different view in Alexandria, the church saw the need to formalize their doctrine. And so from that first ecumenical council to today, like you have a systematic theology textbook, because a group of people, along with a general editor, thought it was a good idea to put down the orthodox, or if you're looking at it from a Protestant, or not just Protestant, but Reformed or Wesleyan, or if you look at it from a Catholic or even Eastern Orthodox, if you look at it from these varying perspectives, the church thought that it was important enough to write this stuff down. And that is a New Testament tradition. I mentioned that last class period. But what the authors of the 27 books of the New Testament did, in addition to being moved on by the Holy Spirit to create this canon, in addition to that, what these writers did was they created a tradition within Christianity where Christians write things down. And that has persisted until now. I'm going to have you write a paper in this course. The reason I'm going to have you write a paper in this course is because it is a tradition within Christianity, which is a tradition that has been adopted primarily in Western liberal arts. That if you do any sort of research, you write it down. Not to say Christianity has a monopoly. I'm just saying that Christianity made it very important to do research and to write things down. So you being in this class or pursuing a degree in theology at Elim Bible Institute and College, you are in that tradition. It's very important that you learn to do that. And as you advance in your theological training, if you decide to go to graduate school or even get your PhD, one of the things you will learn to do when you're working on your PhD is you will learn to defend your papers. It's one thing for you to write a paper to me, and then I respond to that paper and I make notes in the margins and I say, hey, here's where you really got it right, and here's some things to think about, that sort of thing. Is you will move from doing that to presenting your research papers to a room full of people who know as much or more than you, and then they will offer critical feedback on that. And so that is a standard procedure in Christianity that was created by the New Testament writers, and that the early church picked up on. And when there was any sort of challenge at all, the early Christians took to pen and paper, before we had paper, right? Papyrus, to pen to papyrus, or whatever they were writing on, and defended these doctrines. So here are some of the controversies and doctrines or heresies that the Christian church faced in the first 450 years. I'm not going to talk about all of them, just going to talk about a few. So before we get started, I'm going to take a drink. Tastes like a national championship to me. All right, let's go. So first threat, really, intellectual and doctrinal threat that the church faced. And you may, if you've done any preaching, if you've done any studying of the Gospel of John particularly, You may have heard or read something about Gnosticism, or if you've taken a class in the Gospel of John, or a class in some of the Johannine literature, you may have encountered Gnosticism. So Gnosticism was the first real doctrinal and intellectual threat to Christianity, and it posed that threat in the earliest days of Christianity, in the first century, while the apostles were still alive. It was a very popular Greek intellectual, sort of a philosophical / religious system. And so it's important when you think about the Greeks, think about these philosophers and intellectuals that Paul debated. When my oldest daughter, when Rebecca when she graduated from high school, she wanted to go on a trip. So my wife Jessica and I and Rebecca got on an airplane and we flew to Greece. My daughter wanted to go to Italy, and I'm like, that's really close to Greece. Can we go there? And so we went to Greece, went to Athens, Greece. And on one of our days in Athens, we took a van. We hired some people, a tour guide, and took a van all the way to Corinth, to the ancient city of Corinth. And I have pictures of my wife and I standing on top of Mars Hill. If you remember that story from Acts, where Paul stood on top of Mars Hill and he gave an impassioned sermon. And so these Greek philosophers, we tend to think of philosophy as an intellectual pursuit, the pursuit of ideas. Philosophy has become sort of the study of how we think through issues, which is very important. And not everybody gets philosophy. I don't mind telling you that in graduate school, I struggled with some of the philosophy classes because I don't think like that. I tend to arrive at my conclusions pretty quickly, and I think in black and white. But philosophy requires you to really think through all angles. And that's why when you're reading philosophy, sometimes it's hard to keep up, because these philosophers are just attacking issues from several different angles. I don't know if you follow Jordan Peterson or not. He's a psychologist from Canada. I think he lives in the United States now, but he's incredibly intelligent when he talks about social issues in psychology. It's very difficult to follow along because Dr. Peterson will mention almost every aspect of an issue. So he really has a mind for philosophy. But for the Greeks, philosophy wasn't just about how we think and ideas. Philosophy was the religion. The Greeks had graduated beyond their pantheon of gods. And really, for the Greeks, intellectualism was the religion. And so this is what we see in Gnosticism. Gnosticism is a Greek philosophical and religious system whose primary concern was separating the divine from the physical. So Gnostics believed that things of the spirit, that includes ideas. So you can't think spirit in terms of Holy Spirit. You have to think spirit in terms of a concept, of a non-material entity, ideas, thoughts, motivations, higher philosophy and revelations would be spirit for a Gnostic. So they believe that things of the spirit are what constituted reality. So the things that are real are the spirit, ideas, that sort of thing. And then the physical manifestation of those ideas is not the reality. So typically, we would think of reality as the things you can touch, right? Like this computer screen is real. This desk that I'm sitting at is real. This chair that I'm sitting in is real. But for a Gnostic, and I know this may be a little difficult to sort of wrap your mind around, but just follow me through this. So take the chair that I'm sitting in, for instance. A Gnostic would say that the chair is not real, but the idea that led to the creation of the chair is real. So reality is not the chair, but chairness, if you will, like the desk or any idea. And so in this philosophical religious tradition of Gnosticism, they had this idea that the highest expression of spirit, the highest expression of divinity, was this thing called the Logos. And the Logos was this unknowable, unapproachable, completely removed aspect of divinity. So there was no commingling of the Logos and the physical. So in Gnosticism, you had this hierarchy of spirit. And remember, I'm not talking about Holy Spirit or spirits like demons. We're talking about spirit as an idea, as a concept. But within that realm of spirit for Gnostics, they sort of had this hierarchy. And at the top of the hierarchy was the Logos. At the bottom of the hierarchy was the temporal world or the physical world. And because there was such a distance between Logos and physical, that the physical, including humans, could not fully know the Logos. And so what we saw in early Christianity was we saw Gnostics would come into the Christian church and convince the Christians, or try to convince the Christians, that what they believed was close to reality, but it wasn't fully reality. So one of the things the Gnostics disputed was that Jesus was fully God and fully man, because spirit, divinity, cannot reside with humanity, right? They didn't believe that Jesus was fully God and fully man. They believed maybe he represented something, but he wasn't that something. And the advent of the Holy Spirit and spiritual gifts, Gnostics would deny those because spirit or divinity can't interact with humanity that way. So logos at the top, flesh or physical things at the bottom. So think about this for just a second. So think about Gnosticism and what Gnosticism was teaching. And now go to the first chapter of the Gospel of John. And I want you to think about what I just told you about what the Logos is, and read the first chapter of John. So here it is. I'm going to read, and I'm not going to say word, I'm going to say Logos. This is what John opened up his gospel with. In the beginning was the Logos. Gnostics are on board with that. And the Logos was with God. So far, so good. And the Logos was God. Okay, Gnostics are in. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. In verse 14, what does the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 14 say? And the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the one of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So John's gospel is addressing, to a large extent, Gnosticism. Not completely. That's not the only thing John's gospel does. But John's gospel is, in my opinion, you're going to find theologians that maybe don't think Gnosticism is a big a deal with John. Those people tend to think John was written later than I do. I think John was writing specifically addressing Gnosticism, not just Gnosticism, but Gnostics in that first chapter. And so the appeal in the church when Christians would embrace Gnosticism, a lot of it was related to special revelation. So Gnostics taught that a human was saved, not in the sense that we think salvation, but a human was rendered accepted by the divine. We'll say it that way. In Gnosticism, through gnosis, the Greek word is through knowledge. The Greek word is gnosis, and because they were able to achieve this special knowledge or special revelation, this was appealing to some Gentile, some Greek early Christians, because really what it did was it created a spiritual elite. But fortunately, what we see is that Gnosticism begins to fade in the 2nd and 3rd century, and we don't really have that much of a problem with Gnosticism. Back in the 80s, I'm 51. If you're my age or close, you may remember in the 80s, the New Age movement sort of wormed its way into the Protestant church in the United States, and so that was in some areas, some ways, a form of Gnosticism, but for the most part, Gnosticism is not a challenge to the church at all. So that was the first real controversy that developed in the Christian church. So moving from Gnosticism, the second major controversy that revealed itself in the church was Montanism. Now, I'm going to try to be relatively succinct in this portion of the lecture, but you just need to know that I'm working on a pretty extensive research project leading to a dissertation on Montanism. And so over the last year or so, I've read more than the average person on Montanism. But there was a Christian named Montanus that lived in what would be modern day Turkey, lived in Asia Minor in the 2nd century. And he was accompanied by 2 women whom he called prophetesses. And so these 2 prophetesses and Montanus developed a movement that lasted in the Christian church until about the 5th century or so. And here's what Montanism was. Also, you see later writers that refer to it as the new prophecy or the new revelation. We refer to it as Montanism now, but it was referred to as the new revelation or the new prophecy by people that would write about it up to modern era, really, mostly. So the unfortunate thing about Montanism is that you can't really find anything written by the Montanists. Most everything that you find about Montanism was written by people that thought it was a heresy and that were in some way biased against it. So that is a really big problem. I'm not aware of very much extant or even copies of Montanist writings that really reveal the internal workings, but we do know something about them from Eusebius and some other writers throughout history. But here's what Montanism was. So at this time, in the 2nd century, from the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 until some point in the future, 5th, 7th century, whatever, the church was a charismatic community, meaning that the church was a community where the spiritual gifts were exercised with freedom. So in the average church, you had tongues, you had healings, you had interpretation of tongues, you had prophecies. So the church was a charismatic community. Well, then Montanus comes along and he says that he sees a trend where some of these spiritual gifts are beginning to fade in the church. And so what Montanism is it's a revival of the charismatic gifts in the church with an extra sort of layer related to prophecy. And that is when Montanus or one of his followers would prepare to deliver a prophecy, they would begin to shake ecstatically. They would fall out. They would act erratic. They would dance. They would shake. They would rock back and forth. And when they issued the prophecy, they issued it in first person. And what I mean by that is when the prophet in Montanism, Montanus or Prissa or Maximilla, one of the prophetesses, when they would issue a prophecy, they would say something like, "I am God, and this is what I say." So in Montanism, when the person would utter the prophecy for their community, it would be God speaking through the person in first person. So essentially, what you had a group, the Montanists, who were orthodox, as far as we can tell, orthodox in every way. They didn't deny Jesus. They didn't any of that. Not that we can tell, not in any significant way. The rub was the way that they would issue prophecy. Generally speaking, the early church just kind of steered clear of them, with the exception of Tertullian. Now, as you read in your book and you study about the early church fathers, you are going to read about Tertullian. Tertullian, I don't know that you can say he was a Montanist. I think he was. But you can certainly say that Tertullian was favorable toward the Montanist group, toward the new prophecy or the new revelation. And so essentially, the church just ignored them for the most part because they weren't really doctrinally, they weren't really presenting any challenge. They were just weird, I guess if you want to say that. But as time marched on, and as the church became less and less charismatic, the Montanists were viewed as more and more charismatic, right? Because they were doing things that just made everybody uncomfortable. It would be similar today, if you go to a small town in the South. I'm from the South, so that's what I kind of identify with. But you can go to any small town in the South, and there's going to be a Baptist church on every corner, just about. There's a First Baptist church in the middle of town somewhere. There's a Methodist church, probably a small Episcopal church with 5 people in it. And then, there's going to be a Pentecostal church or two. When all the pastors get together, the Pentecostal pastor is there. And when they have large community gatherings and all the churches are there, all the Pentecostals are there with the Baptists and the Methodists and the Episcopals and all of that. And everything's fine and dandy. And nobody really has anything against anybody else. But if the Pentecostals came to the First Baptist Church on a Sunday morning and during worship started speaking in tongues and interpreting tongues, it would disrupt the service and it would freak everybody out, right? Because it's one thing to know about it. It's another thing to kind of be in its presence and witness it. And so essentially, as the church became less charismatic, Montanism was still sort of thriving until eventually Montanism died out in the 5th century. But the important thing about Montanism that won't even come up really until the 20th century. And I'm not going to discuss it here, but we will discuss it then when we have our discussion of Pentecostalism in the 20th century, is that there are quite a few similarities between what the early Montanists were doing and what the early Pentecostals did. It's very similar. There are many people, and I'm one of those people, there are probably just as many on the other side of the issue. But I don't think Montanism was a heresy. Some people still do, but I don't. I think that it was a controversy, and it was a controversy that eventually died out. And there are some early church writers beyond the 2nd century, into the 3rd, 4th, 5th century, that when writing about Montanism, considered it a heresy. So it wouldn't be unusual for you to pick up an early church writing. Eusebius is a big one that speak harshly against the new prophecy. But when you consider what we know about Montanism, other than the fact that it made everybody nervous, I don't know that you can consider it a heresy. But I guess a lot of that remains to be seen, because we don't really have the Montanist perspective. We just have sort of a third party perspective. When I was getting ready to do my research project, I talked to a pastor. He's has a PhD up in Canada. I think he's retired now. I've got a book on my bookshelf over there somewhere, but back in the 80s, he did a research project on Montanism. Or actually, the spiritual gifts in the early church is what he did, and he spent a lot of time talking about Montanism. And so when I was getting ready to do my research project, I was put on to him, and so he and I talked on the phone one day for an hour. This has been several years ago, actually, before I ever entered my PhD program, because I knew what I wanted to do. And he made the comment that somewhere out there, buried in some cave or some house that hasn't been excavated yet, there are probably scrolls that reveal more insight into the Montanist community, but we don't have them, may never have them. But that's really the second major controversy that arose in the church. It was a revival of sorts, because Montanism had quite a few followers, particularly in Asia Minor, and it spread across that area. And it was a charismatic revival that some think maybe extended the charismatic nature of the Christian church, which eventually sort of died out and wasn't resurrected until the 20th century during the Pentecostal revival. So anyway, so Gnosticism and Montanism, those are two early controversies. The third one, and we alluded to it last week, another drink. We alluded to it last week, is Donatism. So if you remember last week's lecture, we talked about the Diocletian persecution, where people were required to present a sacrifice, and then they would receive a libellus saying that they had made the sacrifice. And I mentioned there were Christians who made the sacrifice, right? Instead of being, beheaded or burned or put in the arena, they made the sacrifice. Well, there was a Christian in a North African church named Donatus. I don't believe he was a deacon or a presbyter. He was just a church member, a Christian in North Africa. Well, he wanted to exclude a man named Cecilian from his office as a bishop, because Cecilian was consecrated as a bishop by Felix. Now, when a bishop is consecrated, typically there would be foot washing in some areas. At this time, mostly there'd be probably foot washing, and then the person who is being put forward to become a bishop, the bishop over them doing the ceremony would administer communion to the new bishop. That's when they would consecrate them and then they pray over them. And so Donatus didn't want Cecilian to be a bishop, because Felix, during the Diocletian persecution, made the sacrifice and received the libellus. And Christians who performed that sacrifice were considered traitors. They, as far as generally speaking, the church was concerned. They had turned their back on Jesus. Not that Jesus couldn't forgive it, but it was a big deal because a lot of people died. A lot of people that didn't turn their back. And so Donatus argued that because Felix didn't remain true to the faith, he was unworthy of being a bishop, and specifically unworthy to consecrate another bishop. So Donatus had followers. So what Donatus and his followers did was they appointed their own bishop, Majorinus. Majorinus remained a bishop for the rest of his life. And he finally died in 313. And when he died, Donatus's followers made him a bishop. So Donatus became a bishop in Majorinus's place. Well, shortly after Donatus became a bishop, Emperor Constantine was distributing aid to churches in North Africa, financial aid. And he didn't send any to Donatus. And Donatus complained about it to other bishops. He's like, why am I not getting anything? And essentially what the message came back was, well, we don't recognize you as a bishop. You're kind of doing your own thing. And the emperor doesn't recognize your authority as a bishop. So Donatus complained enough that the church held 2 synods. That's S-Y-N-O-D, a synod. This is a smaller gathering that's not to the level of an ecumenical council. So this is not every bishop in the Christian church. This is just a smaller group of bishops. And so there were 2 synods that were held to discuss the Donatist controversy. And in both of those synods, they ruled against Donatus, which I know you're probably thinking, that's a surprise. You would think that the other bishops would say, well, Felix turned his back on Jesus, he lost his authority. But the church did the opposite. The church, the bishops, said that although Felix sinned, and although Felix turned his back on Jesus, and to whatever extent he had received forgiveness for that, they don't know. But the major point was, Donatus's major point was, look, he's committed an unpardonable sin, and he can't administer the communion. Can't do it. Well, the bishops came back and told Donatus, you know what? The person administering communion, that their sinfulness does not negate the holiness of the sacraments. So just because a sinner administers the sacraments, it doesn't lessen the holiness of the sacraments. And so both of the synods agreed that Donatus was in the wrong because Donatus thought that the Eucharist or the communion was invalidated because of the person that was administering it. But the synods came back and said, sure, Felix sinned, but Felix's sin doesn't negate the holiness of communion. So what the Donatist controversy did, which is interesting, very interesting thing that happened very early in the church. The Donatist controversy went a long way towards strengthening the office of bishop. So I want you to think about the potential consequences of this, whether you think Donatus was right or whether the bishops were right. And that's a larger discussion. And if we were in a classroom in front of a whiteboard, we would have the discussion. But think about the implications of that potentially. What the bishops said was, even if the bishop is a sinner, the communion elements aren't less holy because the bishop is a sinner. And so this would do a couple of things. Number one, it would pave the way for an argument that Augustine would make about the authority of the church in terms of salvation. Now, what authority does the church have in terms of declaring salvation for an individual or administering salvation? So, over time, again, you're going to read through all this, but over time, what we see is that in the Christian church, we see a trend towards salvation being a matter of partaking of the elements. Right? We see it particularly in what eventually became Roman Catholicism. And so we see this moment, this Donatist controversy. We see it paving the way for Augustine to make his argument. And we see it paving the way for more authority in the hands of the bishop that's recognized by the church at large. And so the Donatist controversy was very important in its day, but also is very important for the future, because you got to think about it from Donatist's perspective. Who has the right to appoint bishops? We don't have the apostles anymore, right? So we don't have one presiding bishop. We have the college of bishops, if you will. But from Donatist's perspective, who gives you the right to appoint a bishop? We'll appoint our own bishop, right? It was really kind of the first major sort of protest, if you will, among Christians. Didn't last very long, and not in the grand scheme of things, didn't last very long. But anyway, so that was Donatism, which led the way to Pelagianism. Now, Pelagianism is in the next century, so we had Donatism in the 300s, and then you get into a little later in the 300s, you have a monk named Pelagius. And Pelagius, this is Pelagianism. Pelagius taught that people are created as free souls the way Adam was created. So to summarize Pelagius's teaching, and it's, you and I take it for granted a little bit, but we take for granted the orthodox teaching that the sin nature of humans comes through Adam. Now that's important when you're talking about Jesus, right? Because Jesus was, so Joseph wasn't Jesus's biological father. The sin nature comes through Adam. That's what the Christian church teaches. Well, in the 4th century, there was a monk, Pelagius, who said, I believe that every human is born a free soul, the way that Adam was born. There is no inherited sin nature, but people inevitably do sin because of the weakness of the flesh, not corruption of the human will by original sin. He taught that humans could cooperate with God to achieve salvation and holiness, and that salvation was not exclusively the work of the Spirit. It was a cooperative effort between God and humans. And Augustine lost his mind over Pelagianism, and he was the tip of the spear for combating Pelagianism, and essentially taught the orthodox view, which is that sin comes through the seed of Adam. And Augustine began teaching the concept of total depravity. We will discuss total depravity again when we talk about the Reformation, because outside of Augustine, it's really John Calvin that brings up the idea of total depravity. Now, they mean similar things, but the way the church viewed total depravity in Augustine's day was a little different. But Augustine taught that humans are depraved and are unable to exercise their will in regards to matters of salvation. So Augustine, in response to Pelagian, began teaching a version of what we know today as Calvinism. But there's an interesting response from Augustine's peers. Augustine's peers agreed with him. The other bishops, the other early fathers, agreed with Augustine that Pelagian was wrong and that sin was inherited through Adam and that humans are depraved because of that sin nature. But they are not totally depraved in the sense that they are unable to respond to God. And so the early church basically said to Calvin, you're close, but you missed the mark on your interpretation of election and predestination. And so why Pelagianism is important is because, number one, it settled the matter from an Orthodox perspective about how sin is transferred, right? And the second thing that it did is from the 4th century, there's really only one person between the 4th century and the 16th century that made a case for Augustine's view of election and predestination until you get to the Reformation. And when you get to the Reformation, when you get to Martin Luther, John Calvin, Zwingli, some of those guys, Augustine is the number one church father that I think someone told me that Luther quotes Augustine over 900 times in his writings. Like Augustine was in a lot of ways the theological father of the Protestant Reformation, because it was Augustine's ideas that really fueled a lot of what Luther and particularly Calvin did. So we have these major heresies that would settle some matters for the church, and it would pave the way for other issues. And so most of these major controversies were over by 451, but they forced the church to consider their beliefs, and they cemented the notion that the bishop, and here we go, we're going to wrap this lecture up by talking about the rise of the bishops. Here's what these heresies did, in addition to helping to establish an orthodox position on these controversies. It really cemented the notion that the bishop was important in 3 ways. The bishop was the tip of the spear for preserving and protecting orthodoxy. The bishop became from Arian forward, it was the bishops that were protecting and preserving orthodoxy. They were also protecting and perpetuating church traditions, theological traditions, ecumenical traditions, the traditions of baptism and the traditions of how the church did communion and other things that the church did. And the bishops were the ones who were guarding purity in ecclesiastical matters, church government matters. So you had the bishop as the one that stood at the tip of the spear for what we believe, how we worship, and how the church is governed. And so as the church grew and bishops were appointed, so you got the church, think about it from the book of Acts, everybody's in Jerusalem, then you start moving out, right? Now you're kind of in all the major areas of the former Roman Empire, and Paul's over here trying to go to Spain. Eventually Christians go to Spain. You've got North Africa and the Near East and up into England now. Like you've got like the known world is Christianized. And so you've got bishops in all these areas. Well, what the church did was they created a hierarchy among the bishops. So you had and I don't mean the bottom in a negative sense, but you had the average Christian in a church, then you had deacons, right? Then you had elders, which includes your pastors, and then you had bishops, right? And you had bishops in all the major areas, but then the church decided that it needed another level of government, and it created the cosmopolitans. Now, the cosmopolitans were bishops that resided over influential cities in Christendom. And there were 5 cosmopolitans. And they are at Rome, because Rome was the historic capital of the Roman Empire. You had Constantinople, which is modern day Istanbul, because Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to a city he created called it Constantinople after himself. So you had Constantinople, that's 2. The 3rd is Antioch, Syria. The 4th is Alexandria, Egypt. And the 5th is Jerusalem. Jerusalem is chosen because of its historic value. It's an honorary status. So you had these 5 cosmopolitans who were referred to as, well, let me back up. So as time marches on from the creation of the New Testament, I mentioned last week that Greek was the language of trade. People knew Greek. Well, as time marched on, if you looked in the western part of the Roman Empire, people were speaking less Greek and they were speaking more Latin. In the eastern part of the Roman Empire, you had people that were still speaking Greek. So what was happening in the Christian church was you had half Christians that were speaking, primarily half that were speaking one language and half that were speaking another. And so in addition to languages, you start to see some other traditions that develop, which we're going to talk about when we talk about the schism of the church. We have some other traditions that begin to develop. And so in regards to language, when you think about these 5 cosmopolitans, there were 4 that were in the east, right? Jerusalem, Alexandria, Egypt, Antioch, and Constantinople. Those were all in the east. And those cosmopolitans all spoke Greek, and they were called by the Greek name pater, which means father, right? So they were referred to as patriarchs. Pater is the root word for patriarch, and so we refer to the 4 cosmopolitans in the east as patriarchs. And then the cosmopolitan over the city of Rome, which spoke Latin, was called Papa, or which is the Latin word for father, which we call the Pope. So the Pope was the cosmopolitan over Rome, and then you had the other 4 patriarchs over the areas in the east. And so these cosmopolitans ruled the church as equals, and together they would call for synods and they would call for councils. And so as the Roman Empire began to fall, these cosmopolitans were in place to provide leadership and to provide structure, to provide theological and ecclesiastical leadership to the Christian church as the emperor became less and less important, right? So as the bishops began to rise and the emperor began to decline, at some point they passed each other and the bishops became the primary ruling body in the Christian church until there was no more emperor, right? So from there, we see a lot of different traditions develop. We see more interaction between the bishops. We begin to see some dissensions and we begin to see some other challenges as some of these bishops began jockeying for power. As the Roman Empire falls, you're going to see these language differences, exacerbate the problems. Communication is going to go down because you don't have one empire to keep them together. Now you just have Christians in various, nation states along the Mediterranean. And so you guys will cover all that in the next section. But it's important to think about early Christianity. When I say early, I mean 2nd to the 5th century was very valuable to the life and to the health of the Christian church. Because what you have from the 2nd to the 5th century, after the last apostle dies until about the 5th century, you have a religion that originally was just seen as a branch of Judaism become the predominant religion in every major country in Western Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, it was growing at a tremendous rate with no sign of slowing down. And in almost every country that you see in that North African, Western European, Eastern European, and Middle Eastern area, those were all Christian nations led by Christian bishops, with some of the greatest thinkers, in my opinion, in the history of Western civilization that wrote and defended orthodoxy. And so we'll discover sort of how the church moved forward from there. But that is essentially our lecture for tonight. That is some of the major heresies, and that is sort of a foretaste into what's to come through how the bishops gained power. So that's all I have. We're at 55 minutes, almost 56 minutes. If you have a question, feel free to type that into the chat box, and I'll see if I can answer it. And I'll hang around for just a minute. By the way, I have 5 kids, 3 that are out of the house while you guys are typing. 3 that are out of the house. So 2 that are here, 1 that turned 18 yesterday and 1 that's 16. And so beginning the week after Christmas, my wife had COVID, and then I got COVID. And then a week later, my 16-year-old got COVID. And now my 18-year-old, whose birthday was yesterday, has COVID. And he's supposed to go to Miami with my wife to a Miami Heat basketball game tomorrow. So we're doing all the things that we've read and heard that help exacerbate healing and trying to get him better so that he's negative to go to his basketball game. So, all right. So if we don't have any questions, thank you guys for hanging out. This will be posted to the YouTube channel for you to view. If you have any questions, email me or text me. And thanks a lot for hanging out. You guys have a good night.